The morning sun rose slowly over the quiet town of Lanford, casting a warm amber glow through the slightly faded curtains of the Connor family kitchen. There was a unique, comforting rhythm to this household, a familiar symphony composed of clinking coffee mugs, the sharp hiss of a frying pan, and the overlapping voices of a family that had learned to navigate every financial storm with their wit and collective love fully intact. It was a space where affection was spoken in the language of gentle teasing, and resilience was as common as the mismatched chairs pulled up to the sturdy wooden table. Jackie walked into the kitchen with her usual whirlwind of breathless, theatrical energy, her eyes wide as she took in the rare sight of multiple family members actually cooperating near the stove. She paused by the doorway, gesturing toward the surrounding warmth with a grand flourish of her hand. "Oh, the Connors is live right now," she announced to the empty hallway, her voice carrying a bright, playful cadence that made everyone look up. In front of a fully vaccinated studio audience, Darlene stood near the old counter, holding a chipped ceramic mug. Her face wore the familiar expression of dry, cynical amusement that she had perfected since her early school days. She slowly raised an eyebrow, looking from her energetic aunt back to the sizzling frying pan. "Wait, what?" she muttered, her flat delivery dripping with affectionate sarcasm. Jackie crossed her arms, pointing a finger toward the stove where the rich smell of breakfast meat filled the air. "Hey, I thought David Jacob was not allowed to cook," she reminded everyone, her tone a mix of mock sternness and genuine history. "Not since the Great Grease Fire of 2007. From his usual seat at the head of the table, Dan Connor let out a deep, rumbling chuckle that vibrated straight from his chest. His large, calloused hands wrapped around his favorite mug, the deep lines on his face softening with a mixture of immense comfort and subtle mischief. "Leave him alone," Dan said, his deep voice carrying a wave of reassuring warmth through the kitchen. "I am just happy to see two people cooking in this kitchen at the same time. It gives the illusion that all our appliances actually work." Darlene snorted softly, leaning her hip against the counter as she glanced at the ancient microwave sitting on a nearby wooden shelf, its digital clock permanently stuck in a flashing loop. "You know, I think doing that all the time finally broke the seal that keeps the microwaves in," she remarked, her eyes twinkling with dark amusement. "Just the other day, I was heating up a cup of tea, and it cooked a chicken that was sitting on the counter." The back door opened with a soft click, and Louise stepped inside, bringing a gust of crisp morning air with her. She looked remarkably neat and put together, offering a peaceful contrast to the comfortable chaos of the rest of the household. She walked over to Dan, placing a gentle, supportive hand on his broad shoulder. Dan looked up at his fiancée, his eyes shining with clear adoration mixed with a playful touch of protective warning. "You know you can still change your mind about marrying into this group of maniacs," he told her softly, his voice full of true tenderness. Darlene stepped forward, pouring herself a second cup of fresh coffee. "Yeah, because once you are in, you cannot get out," she added immediately, her delivery perfectly timed as always. From the corner of the table, Jackie began organizing a stack of clean towels, nodding her head in vigorous agreement with Darlene. "I know," she chimed in, her voice dropping into a tone of dramatic experience. "I tried." "Just stop," Dan said, waving a dismissive hand at his sister-in-law, though his smile remained wide and steady. "She is not as scared of none of us." "Oh, well, sure," Louise said, sliding smoothly into the empty chair next to Dan with an easy, confident grace. She looked around the bustling room, entirely comfortable with the noise and the family energy. "She has only seen us on our best behavior." Darlene leaned against the table, a classic, mocking smirk spreading across her features as she challenged her father's optimistic statement. "This is your best behavior?" she asked, looking from Louise back to Dan. "Have you ever seen one of us wash our feet in the kitchen sink?" Jackie raised her chin righteously, pointing an index finger into the air to emphasize the absolute integrity of the household. "While you are here, no ma'am, you have not," she declared with utter seriousness. Before the playful banter could continue, Harris walked into the kitchen, her eyes fixed entirely on her phone screen as she carefully navigated around the scattered chairs. She reached into the refrigerator for a carton of juice without looking up at anyone. "Hey, have you heard from Ben?" Harris asked, her casual voice dropping a piece of heavy reality into the conversation. "Since he said he was thinking about breaking up with you?" The light-hearted atmosphere in the kitchen shifted instantly, grounding itself in the complex reality of Darlene's romantic life. Darlene tensed slightly, her defensive posture returning in a split second, though she kept her facial expression carefully neutral as she stared down at her coffee. "Nope," Darlene replied shortly, her voice clipped and flat. "I think you were playing it right. Best thing you can do is give him the space he asked for." "Oh, yeah," Harris said, slamming the refrigerator door shut with her elbow as she poured her drink into a glass. "I am done with that. Nothing good ever came from a man thinking too long." Darlene tobacco's slow, deliberate breath, trying to project a sense of absolute confidence to the room. "I did put down a hefty deposit on an apartment to move in with him because I want him to be sure that I want to live with him," she explained, her voice carrying a firm edge of determination. Jackie paused her folding, looking at her niece with a mixture of disbelief and deep, maternal concern. "Wow, there is an empowering message," Jackie noted, her tone rich with her signature dramatic intensity. "I do not care what my kids wants. I am getting my man his back." Darlene turned her sharp gaze toward Harris, using humor as she always did to shield her own vulnerability from the room. "Harris, you will understand when you have destroyed a relationship by being a pathological liar like your mother." "Hey," Darlene snapped back, defending her actions with a stubborn tilt of her chin. "When I lie strategically. Pathological makes it sound like I cannot control it." "You were still going to go to Hawaii behind Ben's back," Harris reminded her, her expression completely unyielding as she spoke the blunt truth. "Stop using the truth against me," Darlene muttered, turning her back to the table to hide the sudden flash of genuine emotion in her eyes. The brief silence that followed was broken by the quiet entrance of Mark. The 14-year-old boy looked utterly exhausted, his shoulders slumped under the immense weight of his school backpack. His shirt was completely untucked, and his usually pristine, styled hair was totally disheveled, lacking any of the neat product he normally used to maintain his precise appearance. "Hey, Dad," Mark said, looking tiredly toward the kitchen counter before blinking and shaking his head to clear his foggy thoughts as he addressed Dan. "I am sorry about dropping that bomb about me moving out without any warning." Dan looked at his grandson, his heart aching slightly at the boy, his obvious fatigue. "Hey, it is always hard when your menopausal kid moves out for the 4th or 5th time," Dan joked softly, trying to lift the heavy mood in the room with a bit of familiar comfort. Darlene stepped closer to her son, her maternal instincts taking over as she observed his messy appearance. "Oh," she murmured, reaching out to gently smooth a stray lock of his hair. "Mark, his shirt is not tucked in, and there is no product in his hair. Something is wrong. You okay, or you just give up like the rest of us?" "I was up all night working on a school project," Mark explained, sinking heavily into one of the wooden kitchen chairs. "Magnet school is way harder than I thought." "Yeah, that is what you get for trying to pull yourself up out of generational poverty," Darlene said, her voice softening with deep affection and immense pride for her son, his academic ambitions. "We are rooting for you, but we will save you a spot right here at the table." Mark opened his notebook, his eyes moving across rows of handwritten research notes. "My project is kind of about that," he said, looking around at his family members. "Some scientists say that choices we think we are making of our own free will are really determined by our genes. So I am going to call our relatives all around the country and see if they are like us. I am worried there might be a Connor's gene." Jackie gasped slightly, leaning over the back of a nearby chair with wide eyes. "Wouldn't it be faster to just start looking for a cure?" she suggested, entirely serious in her anxiety. "I know I would be interested in something like that." Darlene sat down in the chair next to her son, peering curiously at his notes. "What are you going to ask them?" she inquired, genuinely interested in the study. "Well, I'm going to see if they share any of our family traits," Mark replied, tapping his pen against the paper. "Low-paying jobs, distrust of authority, alcoholism. I just need the phone numbers of distant members of our family." Dan smiled, a knowing glint in his eye as he stood up from the table and walked over to the small, cluttered desk in the corner of the kitchen. He rummaged through a drawer before pulling out an old, dust-covered address book that had survived countless years of household history. "I have anticipated this," Dan announced proudly, holding the book up like a trophy. "I have carefully curated the numbers of our cherished family in this drawer. These were taken directly off the answering machine that allowed us to avoid them." Dan flipped through the yellowed pages, his thick finger tracing the handwritten names. "Let us see. Dad dead. Who thought he was dead, but he turned up in Pakistan. Cousin Kenny, you have to call this one. You are probably going to be recorded by the federal agents." "Well, let us try one right now," Mark said, feeling a sudden surge of academic energy. He took the address book from Dan, dialed a number on his phone, and placed it flat on the center of the kitchen table on speakerphone. The phone line rang 3 times before a calm, clear voice answered. "Yes, hello? Hey, this is Mark Connor from the Landford Connors," the boy said clearly into the microphone. "Is this Adrian Connor?" "Yes, it is," the voice replied, sounding surprised but polite. "Hey, how are you?" Mark asked, leaning closer to the phone. "Hey, where are you from?" "I am from Tampa, Florida," Adrian answered through the speaker. "Nice. Well, cool," Mark said, gesturing for his family to keep quiet as they all crowded around the table to listen. "I am here with my family right now." "Hi." The entire kitchen erupted in unison, their combined voices creating a loud, chaotic wave of warmth through the phone line. "And I am doing a survey about the Connors for school," Mark continued, returning to his prepared questions. "I would like to ask you a question. I have a relative who drinks beer all day and hides in the garage. Does your family ever get on you about any of your habits?" Never had that problem," Adrian said with a light chuckle from the speaker. Bad habits? Oh yeah, I do have one bad habit of chewing my fingernails, and I do get picked on for that. But I watch a lot of scary movies, so that is my excuse." "Yeah, that is fair," Mark said, writing the response down on his yellow legal pad. "Well, thanks for being a Connor. Bye." Mark ended the call and looked up at his grandfather, a small smile playing on his lips. The family study was officially underway, and the results were already proving to be fascinating. Later that afternoon, the scene shifted to the local hardware store where Dan spent his working hours surrounded by the comforting sense of fresh lumber, fertilizer, and metal hardware. He stood behind the main counter, checking a long invoice sheet, when a local business manager walked up to hand him a package. "There you go. Thanks, Robin," the manager said, offering a quick wave as she turned to walk back toward the entrance. "Ah, thanks," Dan replied, setting the item aside on his clipboard. A moment later, Louise walked down the central aisle, her face bright with genuine excitement as she held up her phone to show Dan a photograph. Hey, she said, her voice filled with joyful anticipation. "I was just over at Madame Sweet Cakes, and I took a picture of the most perfect wedding cake. What do you think?" Dan leaned forward, squinting at the high-resolution image of an incredibly elaborate, multi-tiered white cake decorated with delicate sugar flowers and silver accents. "It is beautiful," Dan admitted, his practical nature immediately taking over as his eyes scanned the details. "But $400 is a lot, unless we are going to live in it." "Come on, it is cheaper than the other one I showed you," Louise argued gently, her smile remaining bright as she tried to convince him to embrace the grandeur of the celebration. "I keep telling you it is not worth it," Dan said, shaking his head with a fond but stubborn expression as he leaned against the counter. "Once my family digs into that thing, it is going to look like a frosted seal after a shark frenzy." Darlene and Jackie walked down the adjacent aisle, pushing a large hardware cart loaded with heavy metal mounts and security equipment. They stopped near the plumbing counter, catching the tail end of the conversation. Hey, you guys, what do you think of this cake? Louise asked, turning the screen toward them so they could see the photo. Darlene took one look at the elaborate design and the price tag, then winced slightly. Oh wow, for $100, she said, her voice dropping into its usual perfect deadpan delivery. What is it made out of, Elon Musk? Louise let out a good-natured sigh, lowering her phone with a dramatic roll of her eyes. All right, I guess I am outnumbered, she said, laughing softly as she tucked her phone away. I will see you later. Dan watched her walk away, a soft smile lingering on his face before he turned his attention to the mountain of equipment on the flatbed cart. What are you looking for, ladies? He asked, leaning his elbows on the counter. Can't be bananas because we do not carry bananas. Save your fancy salesman patter, Darlene said, patting the top of a heavy metal bracket. Now, we're just putting up some big screens for the lunchbox is reopening as a sports bar, and we need mounts. And Jackie also needed a few things for crowd control. I am filling in for Becky while she is at her rehab retreat. Right, Jackie intervened, lifting a thick wooden handle from the cart to inspect it. We're gonna open with a beer special. Bring your own Bears helmet, and we will fill it for $1. Could get ugly. So, I'm gonna need an axe handle and a taser. Dan blinked twice, completely unfazed by his sister-in-law, his unusual request. Aisle 3, he stated calmly, pointing a thick finger toward the back of the store without moving the rest of his body. Darlene shifted her weight, her eyes wandering toward the rear of the building where the outdoor and camping gear was displayed. Hey, is, Ben around? She asked, her voice dropping its sarcastic edge and becoming quiet, almost tentative. He is still living his best life in the little camping section in back, Dan answered, his eyes filled with fatherly sympathy as he looked at his daughter. Good luck, honey. Thank you, Darlene whispered, her heart beating a little faster. She reached over to a display stand near the register. I'm going to take a bag of these pork rinds. Dan chuckled softly, shaking his head at the contradiction. Who can say no to a cute little vegan with crispy pig parts? Better run, Darlene, Jackie shouted as she began wheeling the heavy hardware cart toward aisle 3. It is a lot further than you think. Darlene ignored the comment entirely and walked toward the back of the store, her boots clicking softly against the concrete floor. The camping section was set up with green artificial turf, canvas tents, and folding lawn chairs arranged around a display of plastic logs. Ben was sitting in one of the chairs, looking deeply thoughtful as he reviewed an inventory clipboard. Darlene stopped at the edge of the artificial grass display, looking at the familiar silhouette of the man she loved. Darlene, where did you go? She murmured to herself, feeling a sudden wave of profound nostalgia as she looked at him. It is the set opposite Wellman Cross Street, where your bedroom used to be. Ben looked up at the sound of her voice, his posture tensing slightly, though his face remained carefully neutral. Hey. Oh, hey, he said, setting the clipboard down on his knee. I, brought you some pork rinds, Darlene said, holding out the small cellophane bag like a peace offering. Ben looked at the bag, a small, involuntary smile tugging at the corner of his mouth before he caught himself. Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, he said, taking them gently from her hand. I have had my eye on these since I put them on the rack. Darlene took a deep breath, reaching into her jacket pocket to pull out a folded piece of white paper. I also brought you this, she said, handing it over to him with a steady hand. Ben unfolded the paper, his eyes widening as he read the bold letters at the top of the rental document. Whoa, you put $1,200 down on an apartment, he asked, his voice a mix of absolute shock and confusion. No, I put $1,200 down on us, Darlene corrected him, her voice steady and filled with a rare, raw vulnerability that she seldom showed the world. I am dead serious about us living together, and I want to show you. Ben stared at the rental agreement for a long moment, the silence between them stretching tight under the bright fluorescent lights. Okay, well, this is big, he finally said, rubbing the back of his neck as he stood up. I believe you were serious. And, oh, well, I wasn't expecting this. I might need a minute. Darlene felt a sudden wave of relief and hope wash over her, a bright smile breaking across her face. Oh, yeah, she agreed quickly, nodding her head. I want you to be sure because I know I am. So absolutely take a minute. She turned to give him some physical space, but Ben stood up fully from his chair, holding the paper out toward her. Oh, you didn't mean that literally, he said, his voice dropping into a flat, disappointed tone. Oh, okay. Meanwhile, back at the Connor house, Mark was continuing his sociological study at the kitchen table, which was now completely covered in charts, highlighters, and phone records. Harris sat across from him, idly spinning a metal spoon in an empty mug. Mark dialed another number from the old address book and set the phone down on the table. The call connected with a sharp click, and a cheerful woman's voice came through the speakerphone. Hello? Hi. Is this Lisa Connor? Mark asked, leaning forward with his pen poised over his notepad. Oh, yes it is, Lisa replied from the other end of the line, her tone bright. Hi. This is Mark Connor from the Landford Connors, the boy explained with his best professional interviewer voice. My sister is going to ask you a question. But first, my family is broke and riddled with heartbreak. So what do you think is more important, money or love, and why? Harris leaned closer to the microphone, her interest suddenly piqued by the bluntness of the question. Money, Lisa answered from the speaker without a single second of hesitation. Because you can always buy love. Harris burst out laughing, pointing at the phone triumphantly as she looked at her brother. Yeah, well, you are right. Fair enough, she shouted toward the speaker. Mark rolled his eyes playfully, making a quick note on his pad. So here's my question, he continued, trying to maintain the academic focus. I am a tattoo artist. If I could give you any tattoo, what would it be? Probably a flower, Lisa said thoughtfully after a moment of consideration. Just something generic and pretty. Okay, something I can live with my whole life. Okay, cool, Mark said, smiling at the simple, honest answer. Well, thanks for being a Connor. Bye. He ended the call and looked at his sister, tapping his pen against his chin. The extended family was certainly proving to be a colorful and fascinating group of individuals. Back at the hardware store, the quiet atmosphere of the back aisles was about to be completely disrupted. A young man named Jeff, dressed in a sharp button-down denim shirt, walked up to the plumbing desk where Ben was organizing a large box of copper fixtures. Excuse me, Jeff said politely, looking around the massive warehouse space. Can you tell me where Darlene Connor's office is? Ben stopped what he was doing, his dark eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the stylish stranger standing before him. May I ask who is calling? Ben asked, his voice steady but carrying a firm, unyielding edge. Just tell her, Ben. Thanks, Jeff replied with an easy, confident smile as he adjusted his collar. Ben let out a short, incredulous laugh, stepping out from behind the counter to face the man fully. Oh wow, you are Ben. Okay, you. Huh. You don't look like an uptight buzzkill at all. You look more like a hipster werewolf sort of guy. Jeff blinked twice, surprised by the sudden, intense hostility, but he maintained his casual, confident demeanor. Well, thanks for your opinion, guy, Jeff said, crossing his arms over his chest. I didn't ask. And you are? Jeff, Darlene is my boss, Jeff explained, trying to defuse the growing tension. And I didn't mean anything by that. I'm just saying that you look like a guy who would want to go to Hawaii. Ben, his jaw clenched tightly, his hands forming firm fists at his sides as the pieces of information came together. Darlene told you about Hawaii, he demanded, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low rumble. Sure, yeah, Jeff said, entirely unaware of the deep emotional minefield he had just stepped into. We all share stories at lunch. You know, I cannot believe that you would ask your lady to use her vacation money to pay bills when she clearly needs some emotional downtime. It is a douche move, dude. Ben took a large step closer, his physical presence completely overwhelming the smaller man. Okay, I think I have heard enough about Hawaii, Ben warned, his eyes flashing with absolute anger. Now, just point me to Darlene. Unless you want to end up stuffed into one of those boxes. No, Jeff said, raising his hands in immediate retreat as he backed away from the fierce expression on the contractor's face. Darlene rushed out from the back office at that exact moment, her face turning pale as she saw the two men standing toe-to-toe in the middle of the store aisle. Guys, stop, she cried out, inserting herself physically between them. Ben, it is not his fault. I only invited him to Hawaii because I was so mad at you. Jeff looked between Darlene and Ben, his eyes widening as the true nature of their relationship finally became clear to him. Okay, that is not at all what we were talking about, Jeff said quickly, backing down the aisle toward the front exit. But I am guessing that is what the two of you are talking about now. Peace out. Jeff turned on his heel and practically sprinted toward the main doors, leaving Darlene alone with a furious and deeply hurt Ben. You are going to go to Hawaii with another guy, Ben said, his voice shaking slightly with a mixture of raw anger and profound disappointment. What the hell? You know, why I came down here was to tell you I wanted to move in with you. I cannot believe I was ready to trust you again. No, you can trust me, Darlene pleaded, her eyes filling with tears as she reached out toward his arm, her voice cracking. It was totally platonic. He could have been a girlfriend. Oh, if it was a girlfriend, you would have told me about it, Ben countered, stepping backward out of her reach to maintain his distance. And a platonic trip to Hawaii? The entire island is one big bed. Ben, please, let me talk, Darlene begged, her hands trembling as she tried to find the right words to fix the damage. No, everything that comes out of your mouth is a lie, Ben said flatly, his heart hardening completely against her words as he looked at her. We will never live together. We will never be together. This is over. He turned and walked away down the long concrete aisle, his heavy work boots echoing through the large warehouse, leaving Darlene standing completely alone among the silent displays of tools. By the next evening, the emotional fallout of the breakup had settled over the Connor household like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The living room was completely spotless, the furniture polished to a high sheen, and the vacuum cleaner was running at full blast. Darlene was moving the machine back and forth across the old carpet with a fierce, aggressive intensity, using the loud roar and the physical labor to drown out her own painful thoughts. Dan and Jackie stood near the kitchen doorway, watching her through the glass panel of the swinging door. The vacuum cleaner let out a loud whine as it hit the baseboard, but Darlene didn't even pause. I cannot get Darlene to stop cleaning, Dan remarked to his sister-in-law, his deep voice filled with genuine concern. I mean, I feel bad that Ben broke up with her this morning, but to be honest, the living room is spotless. Jackie nodded, her face tight with sympathy as she stepped into the living room and began waving her arms to get her niece's attention. Darlene, she shouted over the roar of the motor. You have to slow down. Why don't you stop? Have a glass of wine, we will talk. No, just let me do this, Darlene yelled back, not stopping her frantic pace for a single second. If I stop, I'm going to start crying again. Dan walked into the room with steady steps and firmly pulled the power plug from the wall outlet, bringing the vacuum cleaner to a sudden, grinding halt. The room fell into an immediate, heavy silence that felt almost overwhelming. Darlene stood entirely still, her hands still gripping the handle of the machine as her shoulders shook slightly with suppressed emotion. Hey, Ben just found out about Jeff, Dan said gently, walking over and placing a large, comforting hand on his daughter's shoulder. Give him a chance to cool down. No, it won't work. Okay, Darlene said, her voice dropping into a hollow, quiet whisper as she looked down at the floor. He is done. I could see it in his eyes. I'm just going to have to accept the fact that I am going to live the rest of my life alone. Darlene, you are not alone, Jackie said, stepping forward to offer a warm, supportive hug to her niece. Thank you, Darlene said, resting her forehead against Jackie's shoulder for a brief, vulnerable second. I know you have always been there for me. No, I mean, there's a lot of messed up people like you who do not deserve good relationships, Jackie clarified with her usual blunt, unvarnished honesty, trying to lighten the mood in her own unique way. Darlene pulled back instantly, staring at her aunt in utter, speechless disbelief. Oh my God, she muttered, the emotional weight momentarily replaced by shock. But that doesn't mean you cannot change, Jackie continued smoothly, completely unfazed by Darlene's look. I mean I did. But the chances of lightning striking twice in the same family, I'm gonna jump in here. Come on, Dan interrupted, stepping between them and guiding Darlene toward the worn plaid sofa. Just stop, look, sit down. I know this is devastating, but I know someone out there who can help you. No, I've already been to a therapist, Darlene sighed, buried deeply in the cushions as she pulled a throw pillow against her chest. No, there is another way, Dan explained, leaning against the old armchair. It is a little less traditional, okay? It is a life coach. Jackie's eyes lit up with sudden, dramatic excitement. I guess I could come out of retirement, she suggested, striking a proud pose in the middle of the room. No, you stay retired, Dan said firmly, shooting his sister-in-law a warning look that brooked no argument. I am talking about a spiritual advisor, like a psychic. Oh, that is a great idea. Those people are magic, Jackie agreed enthusiastically, shifting her support instantly. One of them told me once to stop being a life coach, and it happened right after the state told me. Look, she is not just a psychic. She has great insight, Dan told Darlene, his voice serious and filled with sincere belief. She helped me see things about myself that helped me make better choices. Before I met your dad, I was a mess. Now, I am in the best relationship of my life. Darlene looked between her father and her aunt, her cynical defenses weakening under the sheer weight of her sadness. I don't know, it just seems like a little woo-woo, she murmured, her voice small. Oh, come on, Darlene, Dan urged gently, his hand reaching out to pat her knee. You know me, I am not a woo-woo person. What have you got to lose? All right, I will give it a shot, Darlene finally agreed, letting out a long, tired sigh. I mean, I cannot feel any worse than I feel right now. Oh no, no, Jackie chimed in cheerfully as she walked back toward the kitchen. You could feel way worse. You know, sometimes you think this is the bottom, but this is just a trap door to the next layer of hell. Later that evening, Dan and Jackie were sitting together at the kitchen table, reviewing a handwritten guest list for the upcoming wedding. The house was quiet, the earlier emotional storms having passed for the moment into a calm evening. Jackie, there is room for both of us to help Louise, Dan said, looking up from his notepad with a soft smile. And thanks for helping Darlene through this. Well, we are about to become family, Jackie said warmly, reaching across the wooden table to pat his hand. So, I want everyone to be in a good mood when they come to our big fancy wedding. There, I said it, now get used to it. Dan leaned back in his sturdy chair, a wry, nostalgic smile touching his lips as he thought about the future. You want a big wedding? He asked, his tone playful. How are we going to do that? We do not know that many people. Well, you don't, Louise said, walking into the kitchen from the back porch, her expression firm but filled with unmistakable love. But I do. I have a big family and lots of friends. The only difference is I do not live with them all. I am willing to pay for it, Dan. Dan looked at his fiancée, his practical, old-school pride wrestling with her generosity and her desire for a true celebration. Trust me, you are going to wish you had that money back to do other things around here, he told her softly, his voice full of protective warmth. Here is a little secret. I was very happy I married Roseanne, but if we had have shacked up, I could have had a boat. Louise stopped in her tracks in the middle of the kitchen, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him with a mixture of amusement and mock sternness. I do not want a boat, she said, her voice dropping into a dangerously calm register. But I wish you had one, so you could sleep on it tonight. I am going back to my place. She turned on her heel with a smile and walked right back out the door, the screen door clicking shut behind her. Dan blinked in utter confusion, looking over at Jackie who was trying to hide her laughter. What did I say? He asked, genuinely bewildered by the swift departure. I was at the wedding. Jackie tobacco's slow sip of her tea, shaking her head at him with fond pity. Would have been a pretty crappy boat, Dan. The next afternoon, Darlene found herself sitting in the serene waiting room of a small, tranquil office on the edge of town. There were no crystal balls, velvet curtains, or neon signs, just soft, warm lighting and a comfortable sofa. And the spiritual advisor smiled warmly as she completed her dinner at a small table. Louise said to say thank you so much for squeezing me in on such short notice, Darlene said, adjusting her jacket as she sat down across from the woman. Oh, sure, and replied kindly, setting her plate aside. I am just finishing up my dinner. Yeah, you know, you are nothing like I thought you would be, Darlene admitted honestly, looking around the completely ordinary room. No beaded curtains, no crystal ball, and you are not all scarfy and jangly like Stevie Nicks. She is a doubter, and, Jackie said, walking into the room from the hallway to join the session, her energetic presence filling the space instantly. Oh, well, and said, her gaze focusing intently on Darlene with a deep, knowing look. Maybe she gets that from your mother, Beverly, because I am sensing. Oh, she is a nasty old buzzard. Darlene's eyes widened in sudden, genuine shock, her cynical defenses completely shattering in an instant. Oh, that is unbelievable, she gasped, looking over at her aunt. I mean, it is one thing to get the name, but to get the right kind of bird? Let me see your hand, and requested, extending her palm across the table. Darlene placed her hand in and her voice rising with a sudden touch of anxious energy. Yeah, before you start in on this mess, my, boyfriend Neville, is he the one? And also, you mentioned my mother. I haven't heard from her in quite a while. Could you check the afterlife? Because I just do not want to waste people's time with a silver alert. And closed her eyes, holding Darlene's hand firmly as a deep, respectful silence fell over the room. The advisor concentrated deeply for a long moment, her brow furrowing as she felt the energy. Suddenly, she gently released Darlene's hand, looking at her with a profound sense of worry and insight. It is unclear which part, whether I should be paid for one reading or two, and murmured quietly, shaking her head. Oh, got you, Darlene said, reaching for her purse to find her wallet. Let us see here. Oh my God, what? And whispered, staring at Darlene's palm from a short distance. I have never seen anything like that before. You are surrounded by such a toxic cloud that I cannot see your future. Toxic cloud, Darlene repeated, the words feeling incredibly heavy in her chest. What does that mean? I do not have a future? Well, no. It is. Your cynicism and your skepticism is so strong. I cannot pierce the veil to give you a reading, and explained thoroughly, her voice gentle but completely honest. It is like I cannot get any light from you. You have no spirituality. Darlene let out a sharp, defensive laugh, though her eyes remained wide with absolute vulnerability. You are spot on, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. Can I split a reading over 2 credit cards? Look, I do not understand, Darlene continued, her cynical facade completely gone now as she searched for answers. I came here because my boyfriend dumped me. What does having no spirituality have to do with it? Well, it is like having barbed wire all around you, and described gently, gesturing with her hands. No one can get close to you. Am I completely off base here? Have the rest of your relationships been healthy? No, they haven't, Darlene confessed quietly, looking down at her lap as the truth of her past choices settled over her. All right, so how do I change it? Darlene asked, her voice filled with a sincere desire for growth. Can you cast a spell or something? And offered a warm, comforting smile, shaking her head. Someone loved Hocus Pocus as a child? Huh, she noted fondly. No, if you want change, you need spirituality. To connect with something that is larger than yourself. Are you talking about God? Darlene asked, the word feeling unfamiliar but important on her tongue. It just depends. That is your journey, and replied, standing up to conclude the session gracefully. I cannot help you with that. Well, there you go, God, Darlene whispered to herself, looking over at her aunt with a mixture of confusion and hope. No God. It is up to you now, Jackie said, stepping forward eagerly to take her turn at the table. Why don't you scoot over and let me take the rest of the session? Scoot over here, Darlene said, sliding out of the chair to let her aunt sit down as she stood up, feeling the first stirrings of a new perspective. The following morning, the sun was shining brightly into the Connor kitchen, warming the room as Dan stood by the stove, carefully flipping fresh pancakes. Louise sat comfortably at the table, a hot cup of coffee between her hands, her expression calm and content. Good morning, Dan said, sliding a golden pancake onto her plate with a smile. How do you sleep? Stick it in your ear, Louise replied, though the corners of her mouth twitched with a hidden, affectionate smile. Okay, look, Dan said, sitting down across from her and taking a sip of his own coffee. I am just confused why you want a big wedding. You are like me, you do not like a lot of fuss. You do not need fancy things. I know, Louise agreed, her voice softening as she looked across the table at him, her eyes full of warmth. It is a shock that a tough gal like me would want a church and a dress and a big wedding cake. The whole thing. It is a shock to me too, but it hit me last night. It is because my parents never had a real wedding. They just went down to the courthouse like they were paying off a traffic ticket. That is how their marriage felt. Dan stared at her, a wave of deep understanding and profound regret washing over his rugged face. He reached across the wooden table, wrapping his large, calloused hand around hers in a steady, protective gesture. I wish I had known that, he said sincerely, his voice thick with genuine emotion. Now I feel like a jackass. You are, Louise laughed softly, squeezing his hand in return with pure affection. But the main thing is, you have to hear me when I tell you what I want. You had 47 years of marriage with Roseanne to learn to read each other as minds. And when we have been married for 47 years, you can do the same with me. From that urn on the mantelpiece. Dan let out a low, hearty chuckle that filled the room. I think you mean Folgers can, he corrected gently, his eyes crinkling. But I get what you were saying. In the living room, Darlene was curled up on the couch, wrapped in a warm, comfortable blanket as she watched a historical documentary on the television screen. Mark sat nearby at the small desk, his laptop open as he compiled the final statistics and notes for his school project. What you watching? Mark asked, glancing over at the screen where an old film of Albert Einstein was playing in black and white. Oh, it is a documentary about Einstein and religion, Darlene explained, her voice quiet and deeply reflective. I am trying to understand how a logical, educated person can get to a place where they believe in God. Mark paused his typing, looking at his mother with a warm, supportive expression that showed his deep empathy. Wait, is my little atheist losing faith in her lack of faith? He asked gently, a light smile on his face. I am completely lost, Darlene admitted honestly, pulling the blanket a little tighter around her shoulders as she looked at him. The psychic said that I need spirituality in my life if I am ever going to change. Do you think there is a God? Mark looked at the television screen for a thoughtful moment, then back at his mother, his young face showing a depth of natural wisdom. I think he is on a break right now, Mark said softly, his tone comforting, but he occasionally returns a call. The front door burst open suddenly, and Jackie rushed into the living room, her colorful coat fluttering behind her as she gasped for breath, her face a perfect mask of dramatic panic. Gabe, she shouted, looking at Darlene with wide eyes. Did you go back to the psychic? Yeah, Darlene said, sitting up quickly on the couch. What is wrong? It is bad news. It is my mom, Jackie announced, her voice echoing through the house with absolute historical proportions. Still not dead. Darlene let out a long, slow breath, a familiar smile of resignation touching her lips as she sank back into the comfortable cushions of the couch. Some things in Lanford, it seemed, would always remain a constant. Later that night, When the house had grown completely quiet and the rest of the family was fast asleep, Darlene stood by the window in the dark living room, looking up at the bright stars twinkling over the quiet neighborhood. She took a deep, steadying breath, her hands resting flat on the cool windowsill as she allowed herself to embrace a moment of true, quiet reflection. "Surprised to see me, right?" she whispered into the quiet night, her voice a fragile but determined thread of hope directed toward the vast sky. "It has been a long time. I know I said you do not exist, but I am going to try to believe in you. I once asked my mom if there was a God, and she said, well, if there is not, we are screwed. So, I hope I am not screwed." She paused for a long moment, a soft, genuine smile touching her lips as she thought of her children sleeping safely upstairs. "Hey, thanks for Mark," she added quietly, her heart swelling with gratitude. "And, by the way, maybe someday you will explain to me why you gave me Harris." Darlene closed her eyes tightly, bowing her head slightly as she recited the simple, traditional words she had not spoken since she was a young girl sleeping in the old bedroom across the street. "Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. And if I die before I wake, well, I will know you are still pissed. Amen." The next morning, the kitchen was once again filled with bright, golden sunlight that washed away the shadows of the night. Mark was sitting at the wooden table, his final project report neatly printed, bound, and ready for submission. He held his phone to his ear, listening to the final ring of his very last interview call. The line clicked open with a friendly sound, and a kind voice answered from the speaker. "Hello? Hi. Is this Carrie Connor?" Mark asked, his pen poised to write the final entry. "Yeah, it is," Carrie replied warmly through the line. Hi. This is Mark Connor from the Landford Connors," the boy said brightly, his voice full of academic pride. I have a question for you. Does your family ever get on you about any bad habits that you have?" "Lots," Carrie answered with a cheerful, self-deprecating laugh that sounded remarkably similar to the laughter that filled Mark's own kitchen every single day of his life. "Oh, okay," Mark said, smiling widely as he noted the final response down on his pad. "Well, thanks for being a Connor. Bye." He ended the call with a satisfied snap and shut his notebook completely, looking over at Darlene who was currently pouring a fresh, steaming pot of aromatic coffee into mugs. "Hey, how is the search for the Connor gene going?" Darlene asked, handing him a tall glass of fresh orange juice. "Well, half the Connors are broke and drink like fish," Mark summarized with a proud, affectionate grin as he gathered his school papers. "But they are really great people. I hope we get to meet them all in person someday." "Oh, I went to a cousin's picnic once," Jackie recalled fondly as she walked into the kitchen, a bright smile on her face as she reached for a piece of toast. "They stole my shoes and my munchie tea. I cannot wait for the family reunion." "So, what is your final conclusion?" Darlene asked, sitting down across from her son and looking at his completed work with pride. "Well, it is a mixed bag," Mark explained, leaning back comfortably in his chair as he looked at his mother. "Some of the Connors are doing really well. So, who knows, I think it is entirely up to you. I think your genes set you off in a certain direction, but you can always change that direction. Like for example, we do not change the sheets a lot in this house, but we definitely could." "Yeah," Darlene agreed, a genuine, optimistic smile breaking across her face as she felt a new sense of peace. "And if nothing else, now I know my genes might be trying to destroy me, so failure cannot sneak up on me like it did you guys." Dan walked into the kitchen at that exact moment, carrying his heavy metal toolbox back from a morning repair job. He overheard his grandson's remark and set the heavy box down on the linoleum floor with a loud, solid thud that echoed through the room. A knowing, resilient, and incredibly warm grin spread across his weathered face as he looked around at his family. "Oh no," Dan declared, his deep voice filled with absolute pride and unyielding affection as he looked at Darlene and Mark. "It did not sneak up on us. It rang the bell, and we opened the door and said hi. We have been waiting for you." The kitchen immediately erupted into a chorus of shared, joyful laughter, a warm and resonant sound that carried out through the screen door and into the bright Landford morning air. It was a clear signal to the world that no matter what challenges or changes lay ahead, this family would always face them exactly as they always had, together, with humor, with absolute resilience, and with an unbreakable bond of unconditional love.